Russian national unity RNE emerged in the chaotic aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. It was founded in Moscow on 16 October 1990 by Alexander Barkashov after he broke away from the nationalist organization PAMID, where he had risen to become a senior figure. Barkashov wanted something far more disciplined and radical than PAMID's theatrical nationalism. Barkashov, born in Moscow in 1953, had originally organized martial arts training and became involved in Russian nationalist circles during the 1980s. In PAMID, he worked with young recruits and served as a security figure before pushing for a hard ideological line. RNE became his vehicle for that vision. Behind the uniforms and displays of discipline was an ugly ideology: extreme Russian nationalism, anti Semitism, xenophobia, anti democratic politics, and admiration for elements of Nazi ideology. RNE adopted a swastika-like emblem, military-style uniforms, and paramilitary training. Its propaganda spoke of racially and nationally defined Russian state and promoted a mixture of nationalism, authoritarianism, and distorted interpretation of Orthodox Christianity. The organization grew rapidly during the economic and social collapse of the 1990s. By the late decade, it claimed tens of thousands of members and had branches across Russia, while reports documented anti Semitic threats and attacks associated with local activists. RNE also became directly involved in the 1993 constitutional crisis when Barkashov and his followers fought on the side of Russian parliament against Boris Yeltsin. Barkashov was arrested after the defeat and later released under an amnesty. By the mid-90s, RNE was no longer simply a Moscow organization. Its network has spread across Russia. Branches and local groups appeared in cities including Moscow, St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, Belgorod, Bryansk, Rostov, and many others. And the movement also crossed Russia's borders. RNA structures existed in Belarus, including Minsk, and there were Russian nationalist organizations identifying with RNA in parts of Baltic region like Latvia. This was important because RNA was beginning to look like less like a political club and more like a network, one organization, many cities, hundreds of local activists, an ideology that could travel from one city to another. A young nationalist in Moscow could meet another in St. Petersburg. Someone from Russia could establish contacts in Belarus. Even in smaller Russian cities where 99% of people were white and Russian and Slavs, there was RNE group because I guess people just wanted to relate to something, be part of something. If they had nothing to be proud of, at least they could be proud of their skin. The same symbols, slogans, uniforms, and political mythology could appear thousands of kilometers apart. The movement was building something resembling a parallel political underground. And then there was the ritual. RNA members used the phrase Slava России, glory to Russia. The greeting was accompanied by extended right arm. The visual resemblance to the Nazi salute was impossible to miss. For outsiders, it looked like something from another era. For the members performing it, it became a sign of belonging. You knew who was one of them, and they knew who you were. The uniform, the symbol, the salute, the words, everything was designed to create separate identity. They were no longer supposed to feel like ordinary citizens. They were supposed to feel like members of a movement, a brotherhood, an army. And this is where German influence becomes particularly uncomfortable. Ania did not merely admire abstract ideas of discipline. Its leader, Alexander Barkashov, openly admired Adolf Hitler and aspects of National Socialist Germany. The organization borrowed heavily from European fascist aesthetics. Black short style uniforms, military formations, authoritarian hierarchy, racial ideology, mass demonstration, political mythology, The message was essentially take the discipline and power associated with Hitler's Germany, but build it for Russia. That did not mean every person who ever attended an RNE event understood and embraced the ideology in exactly the same way, but at the leadership level, the admiration for National Socialism was unmistakable, and that made the organization profoundly different from ordinary Russian patriotism. This was radical nationalism organized as a movement of disciplined activists. On September 1697, a violent ambush struck members of the Russian National Unity. The attack took place in the Orekhovo district of the Moscow region, near the gates of Kurovskaya railway depot. Three men connected to the RNE were traveling in vans to Alexander Chulin, Vladimir Prosvetov, and Sergei Kostyukov. The attack had apparently been preparing for the assault in advance. A makeshift shelter was reportedly discovered near the scene, suggesting that the gunmen may have spent days watching the area and waiting for their targets. When the car approached, the attackers opened fire with automatic weapon and pump-action shotgun. More than 50 rounds were reportedly fired. Chulin, a senior figure within RNE's security structure, was critically wounded. He died on the way to hospital. Prosvetov and Kostyukov survived, although both were seriously injured, but the motive behind the attack remained controversial. One theory was the attackers were planning to rob the man. Chulin was reportedly expected to collect a large amount of money from a bank, around 50,000 according to contemporary reports. However, the money was delayed, meaning the vehicle was traveling without the expected cash. The investigators and RNA members focused their attention on two men, Alexander Monachov and Evgeny Guselnik, who had previously been associated with our organization. The RNA leadership eventually claimed that the two men were not simply criminals but the secret agents who had infiltrated the movement. Alexander Barkashov, the leader of RNE, went even further, suggesting that Russian security services were behind the operation and were attempting to destroy the organization from within. And then, just as RNE was approaching its own collapse, something happened in Minsk that made the organization world even darker. The Belarusian branch of had a young leader. His name was Gleb Samoilov. He was only 22 years old. Samoilov was regarded as the leader of unregistered RNA organization in Belarus. Then on August 5, 2000, he was murdered. His body was discovered in the entrance of his own apartment building. Three stab wounds had been inflicted in the area of his heart. According to the company reports, Samoilov had received a telephone call that morning. He left the apartment, and shortly afterwards, neighbors discovered his body. Police opened a criminal investigation, but the circumstances remained unclear. Investigators said they had little information. They did not publicly identify the killer, and reports at the time said they could not rule out a connection with Samoilov's political activity. And then comes the chilling part. Just weeks later, RNA itself would explode into one of the biggest internal crises in its history. Samoilov was dead, the organization was divided, and the leadership struggle was reaching its climax. To this day, the murder remains one of the darkest unresolved episodes associated with the Belarusian RNA story. Look at the sequence. RNA had spread across Russia. It had developed contacts outside Russia. It had become increasingly visible. Its activists were appearing in uniforms. Its members were using fascist style, symbolism, and salutes. Its leaders were dreaming about political power. And then the electoral project failed. Regional leaders began challenging Barkashov. The movement started splitting, and one of its young regional leaders was murdered in Minsk. Then, only weeks later, the organization itself fractured. On September 21, 2000, senior regional figures moved against Barkashov, was expelled. The movement split, and RNE that had spent a decade preaching unity was suddenly no longer united at all. But there is another theory, and this is where the story enters much darker territory. Some researchers and former observers of the Russian far right have argued that RNA was not simply destroyed by its own internal contradictions. They claim Russian security services had infiltrated, manipulated, or influenced the organization. The theory goes even further that elements within the security service initially tolerated to even help cultivate radical nationalist organizations because it could be useful against political opponents. But eventually, RNA became too independent, too visible, too difficult to control. And once it was no longer useful, the theory says the same security apparatus turned against it. According to this interpretation, the 90s were a period of competition between different branches of the Russian security establishment over control of nationalist organizations. One analysis published by the Center of Research records allegation that RNA was subject to competing influence from the Interior Ministry and the FSB and argues that the organization was eventually split into several parts. Another analysis goes much further, arguing that the security services may have helped create or promote RNA and later use provocations to bring Barkashov under control. But this needs to be understood correctly. This is a theory, not a proven historical fact. There is no definitive public evidence establishing that the Russian state ordered the destruction of RNA. What we can establish is that there were allegations of infiltrations, competing security service interests, and manipulation. And the timing has kept the theory alive for decades because RNA did not simply fade away, it fractured. And once it fractured, it never recovered its former power. Imagine the fury, a radical movement emerges during the chaos of the early 90s. It attracts hungry young men, it provides them with discipline and organization, it becomes useful as a street force. It intimidates political opponents and migrants. It participates in 93 constitutional crisis, it grows, and then its leadership starts believing it can become an independent political power. That is the moment the movement potentially becomes a problem because controlled radical organization is one thing. An independent radical organization with thousands of followers is something else. If the theory is correct, Russian security establishment had allowed the monster to grow and then decided it was time to cut it apart. Again, that's just a theory, but it is one reason the collapse of RNA remains so controversial. Korea wanted to build a movement that would never surrender. It wanted discipline, unity, strength, absolute loyalty. It wanted to transform Russian nationalism into something resembling a political army, and it borrowed heavily from the imagery and organizational mythology of Nazi Germany, but the organization eventually suffered the same weakness that destroys so many extremist movements: internal struggle for power. The leaders stopped trusting each other. Regional commanders wanted independence. Different factions fought over the future, and the movement split into pieces. Some remained loyal to Barkashov, others rejected him. Some formed new organizations. Some moved into wider skinhead and neo-Nazi underground, and some, like Dmitry Dyomushkin, went to build organization of their own. The story of RNA is therefore bigger than Alexander Berkashov. It is the story of an entire generation of Russian radicalism, a generation born in the breakage of the Soviet Union, a generation that saw a country collapsing around it, a generation of young men who found identity in uniform, symbols, street violence, and extreme nationalism. RNA gave some of them an organization. It gave them contacts. It gave them political language. It gave them a model. Even after RNA itself fractured, some of those people remained in the far-right ecosystem. The organization died, but its legacy survived in new groups, new leaders, new symbols, new street movements, and new generations of radicals. The black shorts disappeared from the streets in the form that Russia had known them in the 90s. But the people who had born them did not all disappear, and perhaps that is the most disturbing part of the story, because the collapse of an extremist organization does not necessarily mean the disappearance of extremism. Sometimes it simply means that next organization is being built somewhere else. Today, the RNE is largely associated with activity connected to the war in Donbass, rather than the mass political movement once tried to become. In many ways, the organization reflected Russia's struggle with identity. During turbulent post-Soviet years, the RNA attempted to construct a distinctly Russian nationalist culture, but much of what it presented as uniquely Russian was actually borrowed from the Western extremist subcultures. It tried to mimic the visual language, symbolism, and rituals of Nazi Germany, but while also adopting elements associated with British skinhead parade culture. The result was an unusual mixture that could sometimes look almost theatrical. This was part of wider identity crisis in Russia during the 90s. After the collapse of Soviet Union, many young Russians were searching for something to replace the ideology and identity they had lost. Today, what remains organization is a much smaller fragmented movement, with its most notable contemporary associations being with the conflicts in Donbass. The huge ambitions of the original RNA to create a mass nationalist movement across Russia never became a reality. Thank you for your attention. Please follow, like, and comment. And subscribe, please.